All right, we are officially live. Please proceed.
Okay, I will call to order the Sierra Madre Planning Commission meeting for Thursday, May 21st. Do we have roll call?
Yes, Chair Hutt,
Here.
Vice Chair Dennison,
Here.
Commissioners Catalano,
Here.
Dallas,
Here.
Basai,
Here.
Hefsner, and Spears.
Present.
Okay, great. We have a quorum. We can move forward. First item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Do we have a motion for that?
So move. I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion by Joe Catalano, a second by Bob Spears. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, motion carries unanimously. Next, we'll move to approval of the minutes for the May 7th meeting. Does anyone have any comments or corrections?
I have a couple of very minor ones. On line 32, I would just like to correct a spelling so that it matches the accepted technical term. And that is that that haunched is not H-O-N-C-H. It is correctly spelled H-A-U-N-C-H-E-D. H-A-U-N-C-H-E-D.
We'll correct that.
Okay, that's simple. On line 118, it reads as though I was saying that I didn't have any problem with community compatibility of that design, which is not what I said at all. I said that the houses are spaced too far apart in that immediate vicinity for this to be of concern. I think you'll understand what I'm saying, Vincent, when you see it, okay? We don't need to get into lengthy editing here.
You got it.
I also have a correction. On
Which line?
line 154, right near the end, the name Cole is spelled correctly for most cases, but the person actually spells his name K-O-L. So if anybody wants to look him up, it would help.
We'll make that change.
Okay, any other corrections, comments? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve with those corrections.
So move.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that carries unanimously as well. Next, we'll move to community input. Did we receive any emails?
We did not.
Okay, so no community input today. Then next we will move to our public hearing on adoption of vehicle miles of travel. Do we have a staff report?
You're on mute, Vincent.
Sorry about that. I do have a very brief staff report, and then I'll turn it over to our consultant. So essentially, what we are going to be looking at are the proposed changes to state law, which require the city to adopt new CEQA thresholds of significance, which will modify how the city evaluates projects for transportation impacts. And specifically, the city is required to use vehicle miles of travel instead of level of service that we used in the past as the metric to evaluate transportation impacts in CEQA documents such as EIRs. Specifically, the city is required to use the vehicle miles of travel instead of level of service. And we will develop and hear more about that detail from our consultant. City staff, in coordination with the consultant, prepared the new CEQA transportation impact thresholds. And at this time, staff is recommending that the Planning Commission recommend to the City Council to adopt VMT, or vehicle miles of travel baselines and thresholds of significance, for analyzing transportation impacts under the California Environmental Quality Act pursuant to Planning Commission 20-05. And at this time, I would like to introduce Jolene Hayes. She's a senior associate with Fair and Peers Transportation Consultants, who will be giving a PowerPoint presentation for you this evening and will be available to answer any questions that you have. So I'll turn it over to Jolene.
Thank you, Vincent, for the introduction. Good evening, commissioners. I'm going to share a presentation with you. Make sure I'm sharing the right screen. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
Yes.
And you can all hear me all right?
Yes.
yes.
Okay, excellent. So we've been working with San Gabriel Valley COG. So 26 of the 30 cities within the COG opted in to participating in a COG-wide, looking at this from a more regional perspective for the San Gabriel Valley. And I'll go through why this is happening. Make sure that I can make this slide move. There we go. So the evolution of the CEQA guidelines is really, it's really related to, oops, I went too far. It's really related to a number of rules and regulations that have been put into place starting back in 2006. So the first of those was AB 32, and it was really focused on greenhouse gas and overall air quality impacts. As we've gone through the years, each one of these bills has been passed until we got to SB 743. That's the one that we're talking about tonight. So this rule from LOS to VMT is all prompted from this SB 743. So here's the timeline on SB 743, and it's such a complicated issue that it has taken us 7 years to have a full implementation of this change. So it was signed into law in 2013. It took OPR, the Office of Planning and Research, another 5 years to come up with the rules, what the new guidelines would be. And then because they knew how complicated it was and that cities would have to do a lot of work to go back and adopt these new thresholds, they gave them until July 1st of 2020 to implement these guidelines. So I'm just going to explain what this difference is and why it's so confusing to many and such a big change from how we've typically done things. It's really focused on all of the good sustainable planning practices that we've been pushing for through the sustainable community strategies. So it's focused on infill development, promoting public health through walking and biking, and overall reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Oh, I'm moving the wrong slide here. So let me go back to this because you did not see this. So this is the, it's confusing sometimes in Zoom. So this is the infill development, the public health, and the greenhouse gases. So the goals overall are to reduce the greenhouse gases and align it with the state goals related to greenhouse gas emission reductions, infill development, improving public health. And then the new criteria are really focused on development of multimodal transportation networks, diversity of land uses, so more retail, for example, in residential areas, more residential near employment, and ensuring that the environmental impacts of traffic, such as noise, air pollution, and safety, continue to be analyzed through the CEQA process. So the current method, and this is a visual. So on the left of, I think it's on your left as well, but it's where it says LOS-A, and it shows a very empty street. This was good in the old way. It had lots of capacity, cars could drive through at free flow speeds, and it was really focused on vehicular traffic. On the right, that was considered bad, where it's more congested, traffic's moving much more slowly. But what you also see is that it was missing all of the people walking and the other modes of transportation that benefit from more congested corridors. Not to mention, once you get to this point where your level of service F, a lot of times you want to build up and continue to have some of that infill, but you no longer have any way to mitigate based on a level of service because you can no longer widen your streets. So the methodology, and I'm going to end up showing you a video here in a second that will explain all of this. it's eliminating this level of service metric and replacing it with looking at how we travel. So the vehicle miles of travel associated with us going from home to work, dropping our kids off at school, going to the grocery store. And the whole process is focused on how many miles we're traveling instead of how congested a specific intersection or roadway is. So it's looking at the full trip length and not just a trip, but your patterns all throughout the day. It also really changes the mitigation measures, which we will get into in just a few minutes. Okay, now this is the tricky part. I got to make sure that I have the audio right. So okay. So I'm going to play this little video real quickly.
What is VMT? VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, refers to the distance that a car travels regardless of how many passengers are in the car. So this car, traveling 1 mile, would generate 1 VMT, and 4 vehicles, traveling 10 miles, would generate 40 VMT. To understand how much VMT a person generates on a typical weekday, it's useful to map their travel throughout the day. In this example, Jess starts the day at home, drives to the coffee shop 2 miles away, and then heads to work, which is 10 miles from the coffee shop. After a day at the office, Jess returns home 11 miles away. Later, Jess heads out and drives 1 mile to the gas station to fill up, before driving another 3 miles to the grocery store, and then makes the 2-mile trip back home. By adding together the miles driven, it is shown that Jess has generated 29 VMT for the entire day. This VMT can be further categorized into the individual trip purposes that motivated each leg of the trip. VMT can be organized into 3 typical trip purposes: home to work, or HW, home to other, or HO, and other to other, or OO. This organization is helpful in understanding that trips to and from work tend to generate the most VMT because people are willing to drive longer distances as the benefit of the trip increases. Do you have other questions about?
So that's how VMT works, and that's how it's calculated. The way that we calculate it is we use travel demand models. So for the purposes of San Gabriel Valley COG, you're within the LA County region, and LA County does not have a model separate from the SCAG model, which covers all 6 counties. Some of the other counties actually do have their own tiered models, like Orange County has Octam. Can everybody still hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. San Bernardino has SB-TAM, but in the LA County area, there is not a separate model. So you use the SCAG model, and within that model, there are what's called traffic analysis zones in each one of the cities that line up with the census data that's within those traffic analysis zones. And we run the model to estimate how long the trips are from that particular zone to one of the other areas. And that gives us these regional ideas of how far people travel when they live in a certain city to go to a certain job. So it's estimates, but there is a difference between the home-based trips. So those are the trips that you make, like going to the grocery store, dropping your kid off at school, going shopping, versus the ones that are really focused on going to the office and coming home. So the whole San Gabriel Valley COG region, there were 26 of the 30 cities that opted in for this process. And just to give you an idea of what it looks like across the San Gabriel Valley, the reddish kind of pinkish areas on this map are considered high VMT generating areas, whereas the areas that are in blue and light or yellow are better they're lower than the overall county average. So those are the areas, those yellow and blue areas are considered efficient VMT areas. Those are places where you should focus more development because there's either good transit or there's a good mix of uses, so it's easy for people to walk to the grocery store or even drive just 2 miles to a grocery store instead of a longer 10-mile trip. And that's how these colors are associated with the maps. So there are some ways under the new metrics that are a little bit different than how we use level of service under the old way of analyzing projects. So the state under the new OPR guidance provides for some additional exemptions. In some respects, it's more stringent because whereas projects before that were less than 50 p.m. peak hour trips, that was the threshold. Now you only get 110 total daily trips. The equivalent of the 50 peak hour trips is about 500 daily trips. So fewer projects are going to be able to screen out under the trip generation criteria. This 110 daily trips is still based on how we used to do it for level of service using the IT trip generation book. So that part's the same. It's just you have a much lower threshold. So that means that more projects could be subject to additional evaluation under CEQA. One of the other things that's really interesting, though, that does exactly the opposite is it exempts up to 50,000 square feet of local serving retail. In the past, that would have never happened because it would have tripped more than 50 trips during the peak hour. So some cities are opting for that to be slightly less, but the purpose of it is to really make sure that if a community, for instance, doesn't have a local serving grocery store like a Sprouts or a Ralph's or something like that, that would fit in this category, that they're driving much further. So by putting something like that in that community, you would be reducing the overall VMT for that community. So that's why that exemption's in there. Other local serving land uses like schools, daycare facilities, community centers, churches, those are also considered if they're purely local. Private schools are a little different, but public schools K through 12 are exempt. So there's a number of exemptions that OPR also allows. The low VMT generating area, that's really tied to your thresholds of significance. So if a project is under your thresholds of significance and would not exceed those, we can identify those areas of the city where those projects would fall. And if they're under that threshold, you could screen those out. As you will see in a second, you don't have any of those. So yeah, blue is the area where it's low. Yellow is close. And you might be able to look at the projects a little bit closer if they're in this yellow area and it's a residential project that's being proposed in this yellow area. You could look at some other aspects of what the OPR guidance says and potentially exempt a project that's residential in nature that's more than 110 trips, but it would have to go through a couple of extra steps to get there. And most likely it would have to come up with some kind of mitigation because it's not going to be just under a threshold that would allow it to be exempt from CEQA. And similar with your office projects, you have even fewer opportunities for using the low VMT screening factor for screening out projects that are employment generating projects. And that could be anything, anything that it could even be as much as retail is screened out. There are other aspects that are similar that have employees associated with them. It's not just an office building. You think of all the other types of commercial uses that also generate employment. Industrial uses are another one. So if a project is not screened, there are a couple of next steps that it goes through. And this is what we're working on and we'll develop for the city is a list of traffic impact study guidelines on how to do this next piece. Because dealing with the SCAG model can be complicated if it's not detailed with what aspects of the SCAG model you're pulling out of to get the VMT. There are a lot of different wet metrics that go into calculating VMT, but overall, OPR requires two things. The first thing is that you count all trips. So that means your total origins and destinations coming in and out of the city. And then you need to look at it by trip purpose. So if it's a residential project, you would look at the home-based trips. If it's an employment generating project, you look at the home-based work trips. And then there's some special generators that have different rules. But all of those will be outlined in the traffic study guidelines. So it'll be really clear for everyone how to look at these projects and analyze them. And the most interesting part of this whole process is the mitigation. So the mitigation strategies, one of the first and best ones is to really look at the type of development and make sure that it's a good project for that particular location. And if not, start looking at the other options that might make it a better fit for that location. That's really part of the intent, is to make it more context sensitive. So you can really control a lot from doing that. But the ways to mitigate these projects are really focused on either the type of use and how you develop the project, the size of the project, access to the project, and then you get into some of those travel demand management programs. And those are the strategies that really help identify what the mitigation is going to be for these larger projects. So those include things like telecommuting programs, increasing the diversity of land use, like I mentioned, having some retail in a residential project, for example. Even hotels near major business centers are considered good. So those are hotels can even be local serving. Pedestrian network improvements can be part of it. They tend to not get very much of a reduction, but they're helpful. Even traffic calming measures that promote bicycle use and car sharing programs. So these are, instead of widening a street or putting in a new traffic signal, this is the new world of mitigation for traffic impacts. So where we're at in this process, we've been through the screening criteria and letting all of the cities know what the options are under the new OPR guidance, providing the methodology, which is really using the SCAG model and what metrics should go into looking at both the total trips within those cities, and then also looking at the baseline. So are you going to compare yourself to the city as your baseline? Are you going to compare yourself to your sub area within the San Gabriel Valley COG? Or, I mean, there were quite a few options. So we went through those with each city to see what fit each city best. And then the impact thresholds, OPR recommends 15%. There's other guidance that's since come out through ARB that calls for 16.8% if you omit trucks, 14.3% if you include them. We're including trucks because we're capturing all trips per the OPR guidance. So, which, you know, is a little different than how ARB looked at their study. It wasn't focused on this VMT issue. But we're going with the 15% because it's a little bit more conservative than the 14.3 and is actually in the OPR guidance. So that's what's being recommended for almost all of the cities in the San Gabriel Valley COG. And then the next piece of this will be helping each one of the cities identify what mitigation strategies are feasible and which ones they'd like to help put into this tool that we're developing that will allow developers to go in when they're looking at a site and identify how the project would fare and what are the possible mitigation strategies that they'd be able to employ. And we'll capture all of that in your transportation study guidelines when we're done. And with that, I am here to answer any questions you may have.
So the traffic study guidelines are something that are going to be forthcoming to us. Did I understand that correctly, that you're now working on that?
Yes, the first step is making sure that we know what the thresholds of significance are, because we need those before we can draft the traffic study guidelines.
One other question I have right now is transportation design management, one of your later slides. This seems to largely involve things that are off-site. And what I'm wondering about is this: a project comes to us at the city already kind of packaged, right? Is it going to be incumbent from a planning standpoint that the packaging includes a proposal for all of these off-site mitigations, or are these things that will these off-site mitigations be things that the the Planning Commission and the City Council will have to require of the project during the CEQA process, or what?
So very
How's
good.
it, how's it going to work?
Well, there's a few different strategies that are going into this right now. We just presented to all of the cities last week on what those options are. In some regions, they're coming up with more of like a sub-regional mitigation bank that many cities will cooperate in together. In other places, it's a city that may have already an existing traffic impact fee, and they just modify it by doing an updated nexus study, identify all of the different projects within their city that would help them mitigate overall VMT impacts throughout the whole city. So those could be some of your offsite investments.
Mhm.
What I think the COG is thinking about doing is, at least this was brought up as a suggestion last week, is to figure out a way where some of those larger projects that would benefit multiple cities are identified, especially for cities that don't have very many alternative mitigation strategies available to them. And one of those might even be a TMA, which is a Transportation Management Association, that would do things like promoting transit by giving discounted transit passes, and the developers would pay into that TMA for it functioning. And that would be one of the mechanisms for reducing their overall VMT. And it could be things like bike share and other programs like that that would be hosted by the TMA.
Okay, I have one last quick question then. What we're doing at the Planning Commission level with this, then, how does that relate to the warrants that are needed to make a particular modification? And are we able to manage things if we want to stay below a certain level, a level that would require under other state guidelines to say put in a traffic light?
Well, those are no longer a CEQA issue. Now, the CEQA does no longer care about traffic congestion. So if there is something like that, it would happen as part of your development agreement or some other entitlement mechanism that you have, but it's no longer identified or even analyzed unless a city requires that you still look at level of service somehow.
Okay, but CEQA doesn't preclude us from making judgments about that.
No, it does not. It's just not part of your CEQA process anymore.
I don't know how familiar you might be with Sierra Madre, but if you want to bring the troops out, okay, talk about a traffic light in town. We're very, very proud of not having to have any. Okay, that's an article of faith if you're going to live here.
Well, you will never have to have one under the new rules. And
Oh, good. Okay.
I have a question.
sure.
When were the metrics for the traffic studies that were done for this? And the reason I bring this up is in the last, say, 2.5 months, we've experienced a great downward trend in traffic all over. And we have a community which is relatively affluent, and there are more and more people working from home, which would drive down your HW number. So is it possible that because of one of the side effects of this pandemic, that more people are working from home, therefore we are already in compliance with the VMT?
It's still to be determined, and that's one thing that us as planners are grappling with, how much of this is going to be the new normal. We're not really sure. I mean, the SCAG model and if you look at the latest 2016 RTP model, it projected a 16.8% reduction due to telecommuting. And all of us at the time went, we think that's a little too high. So we've been backing it out to be conservative when we've been doing CEQA reviews. They did it for air quality conformity purposes, and they were given permission to do that through the EPA. Under CEQA, that was considered too liberal and not really addressing the project's full impacts. So we backed that out of the model, especially with our GHG analyses that were project specific. But now we're looking at that and thinking, maybe the SCAG model got it right. Maybe those future cumulative reductions in VMT are actually going to happen. And if they do, that helps the state achieve what it's, the goal of SB 743 is really to reduce the state's overall VMT by 15%. That's the goal. And if what the SCAG model is projecting is accurate, I think it gets us about 10% below. So we're pretty close if like the telecommute happens.
Some communities may find it more difficult to encourage work from home, whereas other communities may have a more of an advantage of that. Communities with, you know, great internet access, which is unfortunately not Sierra Madre, but you know, we have other things. You know, I'm wondering, what kind of studies and what kind of metrics are developed so that we can show that we are reducing BMT through, you know, home work from home or other kinds of things?
Well, a lot of it has to be captured in those TDM measures. So if you say that, you know, this new employer is only going to require its employees to come into the office twice a week, and we can capture that. It's just a matter of monitoring it and making sure that that happens and they don't sell it to somebody else and then all of a sudden they require everybody there full time. But that's how you would do that through this process.
I notice you referred to what you can capture.
Yeah.
Okay. Big brother. What about everything you can't capture?
Yeah, I mean,
Or are you going to you know, there are an awful lot of independent business people, a lot of independent consultants, so on and so forth, that they're not all, not everybody working from home here is working for a corporation outside of the city. I mean, there's been a huge uptick in that in the last 3 months, but you know, as of years ago, we had 10% of all of our households had a home-based business in it, and that's a very, very old statistic before the internet got as strong as it is right now. So I don't know how you get accurate data here without some very, very serious polling.
and it's not meant to be, I mean, even with the old way of doing thing, level of service, that, you know, taking counts 2 days out of, you know, 365 only gives you so much accuracy, even on what your volume to capacity is on a street. So you just got to make your best guess. And the tool that we're putting together that Vincent got to see a preview of earlier today, it will allow cities to go in and kind of play with this a little bit and see what different development looks like and what those strategies might look like for mitigating those impacts. It will be really interesting to see when we start getting some case law on this. You think of when CEQA first started back in the, I think it was late 60s, early 70s. I think it might have been like 71. But there was no case law, and look at where it's gone now. So I think as we start having more court decisions come out on VMT, we're going to see changes, and you'll probably be facing alterations to your thresholds of significance to address some of those. But we just don't know what they are. We're just trying to come up with what we think is our best recommendation to protect you from losing over something that you just didn't know.
I have a question about how these thresholds play out in project review under CEQA. With regard to the filters, is anything that doesn't pass one of the filters require CEQA review and a negative declaration?
You think of the screening criteria as kind of like your initial study checklist. That's the best way of really thinking about that. And if it comes up with something where it's potentially impactful, then you go to the next step, which would be a mitigated neg deck or a neg deck, depending on what that next step looks like. We think for most small projects, you'll be able to get them through that mitigated neg deck. Medium-sized projects might be more at risk, but the tool will really help guide that decision as to where you need to go next in the CEQA process.
And what can you give us an idea of what small and medium-sized projects look like? I mean, one of the things was you talked about the number of daily trips generated as one of the thresholds. Like, say, how many apartments would that be?
It'd be like 11 units,
Ouch.
It seems,
small.
you know, the idea that you would have to have a negative deck for an 11 or 12 unit apartment building, but you could build 50,000 square feet of retail just without any analysis just seems, from a gut check perspective, not right.
And every city, I mean, that's one thing that even though the CEQA, the OPR guidance allows you to exempt up to 50,000, and I know that's something that at least a couple of the cities have said, well, that might be too much for us. Maybe we should figure out what, like a Trader Joe's, what that size is, or, you know, something that would be context sensitive within your community. That's, you know, if you got something like that proposed, that you would be okay exempting that. So it might be 30,000 square feet. And I don't know what that number is for Sierra Madre. I don't know what they're comfortable with, but that's something that you could ratchet down. You don't have to accept a project that's 50,000 square feet of retail if you don't want to.
And how many trips would the office project be? Because that one wasn't exempted either.
It's 100, it's, you know, the 110 trips is about 10,000 square feet of office. So it's
That one
not
doesn't
much.
much harder.
No. And even the industrial, if you think of like mini warehousing, it's, you know, it's, I think it's, I want to say it's 50,000 square feet of mini warehouse because they just don't generate that much traffic. But there's a whole.
And how does this play in with the categorical exemptions? Would those continue to be exempt and you wouldn't do CEQA analysis, or would this bring those out of that categorical exemption?
They continue to be exempt.
Okay,
Like
because
some
I mean,
of the affordable housing.
we do, I mean, most of our CEQA analysis is infill development, and so we don't do CEQA analysis when you're doing you know, a small apartment building or a little commercial building. So that would still track under that, and we wouldn't do this vehicle miles traveled analysis.
You know, once you can get it past that first screening check, which it's really easy to run it through the tool and get an output and just show that there's no need to do anything further.
So John, if I'm understanding what you just asked, you're saying that in the event that we're doing RENA numbers or RENA planning, it's an exempted from the CEQA numbers that we're talking about.
Right. But I mean, I think that one of the issues is we talk about mitigation, and, you know, there's different mitigation measures you can do. But if you have a small project, just the fact of doing a mitigated negative declaration is a big hassle and expense and time burden. And so we want to be careful that we set the thresholds at an appropriate level, not too high so that, you know, we've got big traffic generating things, but not too low so that all projects that people want to do get in further red tape. I mean, that's the whole point of the commercial code update we're doing, is to try to take away some of these burdensome regulations that we put on in the past. So, you know, that's why I was trying to understand what that number of trips really translates to in project size.
I'm gonna see if I can pull this up real quick. I might be able to show you what those look like. It's a little bit more detailed than what I gave you. Let's see. Do you mind if I share my screen again, Vincent? Is that okay? Okay. So this is an idea of what, so there's the 50,000 square feet of community serving retail, and then there's the local K through 12, local parks, daycare centers, and then some of those other local serving retail uses that are included in that 50,000 square feet. It's like gas stations, banks, restaurants, shopping centers. So like I said, if that is too, if you think that's way out of whack with what is typical in Sierra Madre, that is something you could recommend as a reduction in that 50,000 square foot limit. Local serving hotels, student housing, which we're omitting that since you don't have any need for that in Sierra Madre. Like I mentioned, the churches, community institutions, Affordable, supportive, and transitional housing is exempt, assisted living facilities, senior housing. But then when you look at this 110 daily trips, and these are some examples: 11 single family homes, 16 multifamily condominiums or townhouses, 10,000 square feet of office, 15,000 square feet of industrial. Oh, it's 63. I'm sorry, I was off by about 13,000 square feet there on the warehousing, but that's the mini warehousing. And then the 79,000 is really, that's industrial. So that's like your high cube transload and short-term warehousing, which is much, I don't think you have anything like that in your community. And that's more like City of Industry or Irwindale. But those are just some examples that OPR provides in its guidance. But if you look in the ITE trip generation book, you could identify typical land uses that would be under 110 daily trips. And if there are specific ones that you're interested in, we can pull those pretty quickly for you and let you know how much square footage would be permitted in each one of those categories. And there's some other metrics that you can look at that will also get you to that 110 daily trips, whether it's the number of employees, or you can look at, like in hospital uses, it's the number of beds. So there are other ways of looking at it. Hotels, it's number of rooms.
And the 110 trips is recommended by OPR?
It is. That's the max that you can. Anything over that, I've seen 2 cities in California so far push it. Irvine is going with a threshold of 250 trips, and they're trying to tie it back to their general plan. That's half of what they had anticipated. They were expecting 500 trips as being exempt, but we're not sure. I mean, we've checked with legal on it, and they're not really comfortable with that risk. So we'll see how it's things like that I'm really interested in seeing what the case law is going to come out, which side it'll come out on. But right now it's pretty clear in the OPR guidance that 110 trips was as high as they wanted to go. And there were a lot of comment letters over the 5-year period of them putting these guidelines together.
If we had a project that for other reasons was subject to CEQA review, but it, because of this filtering, like say if it was a retail project and it was under 50,000 square feet, would we not be able to analyze traffic as part of the CEQA review? We would do a CEQA review for other things, but we would be barred from reviewing traffic.
Are you talking about traffic congestion?
Yeah.
Yes. Under CEQA, you cannot. It's no longer considered an environmental impact. I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing.
Well, it seems to me that the 50,000 number is too big for Sierra Madre. I mean, my gut would be that we would increase the trip number, but you're telling me that that's, we would increase that a little bit and then lower the 50,000, but we can't increase the trip. So if we're going to make it sort of mesh, that we should at least have that number, if not more. Because if you think of a 25,000 square foot retail building in town, that would be something we'd want to, look at the vehicle miles traveled, I would think.
Yeah, let me add a couple of things, John, to what you're saying there. And if you were to have a store like that in town, that's here where a lot of people can use alternative transportation, walking and so forth. That's an awful lot different in terms of vehicle miles traveled than if it were out in the middle of the tarmac out on Huntington Drive, right? That's no, seriously, you might get but on the other hand, 50,000 square feet, I'm tending to really agree with you that that's a very, very high number for us. That would represent a single floor, say in a supermarket of 200 by 250 feet. Okay, that is a monster. I think that half of that is, as you were suggesting, half of it would be something that, you know, we could reasonably consider as our number. I mean, you know, 200, any floor plate 250 by 200 in the middle of Sierra Madre is really going to be out the window.
Yeah, I mean, there's only one place that would go, right? I mean, that would be if Taylor's got redeveloped. I can't even think of another spot unless there was a combination place. So, you know, I think that that we should recommend moving that component from 50 down to 25,000.
Yeah, well, it would be very interesting. I ought to, after the meeting, to go get the dimensions of Taylor's property in you know, it 200 by 250 square feet. That may even squeeze out their parking, and so by the time you balance that all out, then you're going to have an actual building footprint of somewhat less.
Ms. Hayes, maybe I'm confused. What's the advantage in lowering the exemption?
If you were to lower it, it would just mean that if a project came in that was larger than that, it'd have to go through the full CEQA VMT analysis. Otherwise, it just screens out. It's permitted. Unless you have some other mechanism that would, you know, if you're doing your CEQA initial study checklist, and there's something under one of the other resource areas that would be affected, that you would have to do something for anyways, like that could be, you know, you look at water quality or air quality, any of those other sections of your CEQA document. If there's a requirement, it would fall under that, but it would no longer, even if you did a CEQA document, you still wouldn't look at traffic.
So I guess I don't see why we want to lower the threshold for CEQA if we're just, aren't we just penalizing ourselves? I mean, our codes are going to require that these get reviewed in other fashions anyway, right, John?
Well, I mean, the question is whether you want to do CEQA review or not. And I would think, I mean, just for instance, I just looked at the Google Maps and the whole Taylor's, including the older part that used to be Howie's, is less than 15,000 square feet. So, you know, I would think if we had something that was over 25,000 square feet, we'd probably want to do CEQA review on it anyway. And if we're going to do CEQA review, we'd want to look at the traffic analysis of it. So, I mean, I don't think we're going to have a whole bunch of developments more than 25,000 square feet.
That's more than 3 times the existing building footprint there.
Yeah, so I mean, I think if we lowered that from 50 to 25, it probably would increase the number of reviews that we have from 0 to 1 in the next 5 years. And that one, I think we'd probably want to review. And also, I think it's sort of crazy that we would be exempting 50,000 square feet of retail, but only 10,000 square feet of office. I mean, to me, I would want to bump up, you know, the office, but they said we can't do that. So equitably, I think we should, you know, try to bring the retail down a little bit. Obviously, I would assume this is going to be somewhat of an iterative process, and over the years, we'll be amending this again when we and other cities have more experience with it. But to me, it seems like that number is really high for Sierra Madre.
I have a question. The number I noticed on that document that said 11 single-family homes. We have a couple places in town where they want to build more than 11. How does that impact? Does that impact how we look at the entire development, or they get the first 11 free and the 12th one suddenly we have to begin to do something? You know, how does that work?
Well, there are certain parts of projects that can be exempt, and with housing, typically you look at the whole thing, unless there's an affordable housing piece of it that would all.
These are definitely not affordable housing.
No,
Yeah, no, then
chance.
the first 11 are not free.
So we would now then have to go back and look at, suppose somebody wanted to put 40 some houses in a section of town, then they would be required to look at VMT as part of their application?
Yes.
To be clear, are you saying, because it looked like the way it was drafted, and maybe I read it wrong on the brief showing of it, it was on per location. If there are 47 unique lots that are being
Yeah, but
proposed,
it's
No,
each
each lot,
project.
you can't get into segmentation though.
Nah.
So
It-
we would analyze that when the project comes through, which if we're talking about the monastery would be the specific plan that would get processed. And there's already been discussions that we would run an EIR for that. So if we ran an EIR for the specific plan, we analyze the vehicle miles traveled there would be mitigation measures put in. And once that's approved, when the individual houses come through, they wouldn't have any analysis because that have already been done for the ER would already have been done for the whole project.
Yeah, and I think you're going to get a sneak peek on that one. I'm pretty sure that that particular project was one that we're going to test and see how it comes out. I am pretty sure that's one. Yeah, so at a minimum, you're going to get to see what the initial screening of that project looks like. But I think it's also one that we're actually doing the modeling on, so you'll see what the true VMT generation of that specific project is.
Yes, that is the project that we're going to be looking at as a test case.
How soon is that all going to come about?
We are running the model right now. It's supposed to be done over the weekend. It takes a long time to run the SCAG model. This time it's crashed on us twice so far. It's a really big model. So it's supposed to take 3 days and now we're up to like 7 or 8.
It's imminent.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not talking about November. Or,
No, we'll have the results next week.
all right, cool. Thank you.
Sure.
But will we have the results on that before the city council adopts these thresholds?
When are you guys going to council? Let's see. Madre. Because I have you guys going to council on, yeah, you're not going until June 23rd, right?
Yeah.
Is that
So, I mean, it sounds
Yeah.
like from what you've told us that if 11 single families would trip the threshold, that project will be reviewed. I think if, just again, from a gut check perspective, if that project weren't reviewed, we would feel like we've set the thresholds way too high. So but it sounds like from what you're saying, it will be captured, and then we can look at the analysis when it comes out.
Yeah, and then you can start getting an idea of what those mitigation strategies could or should be, and but prepare yourself because there are no mitigation banks, and unless you have pretty good transit access, which yours isn't awesome, then you're looking at overriding statement of considerations in your CEQA document for VMT, which is going to happen a lot.
Will we also be able to, if to adjust the project size it all to bring certain very difficult mitigation measures to reduce or be able to eliminate some of them? Could we, for instance, say that, well, we can take this measure off the table if it goes from 44 to 38 houses? You can take these 2 off the table if you go to 36 houses. Is there any ability to model to test that way?
Sure.
Is that another 8 days to run every one of them?
No,
It's a serious question.
different.
I don't know how interactive it'll be once you're done.
The modeling that's one of the other major differences between the VMT analysis versus the actual travel demand modeling, that the way we used to do it for level of service. With level of service, it's really focused on the vehicles at a given part of the system. With this, we don't really know exactly how much you're going to get. We have some really good research on it through CAPCOA and several other institutions that have done some real live go out and collect the information and see how much of a reduction you're actually getting from these strategies. But we don't know exactly how much of that's actually going to happen, but that's your substantial evidence, is that we're going to take this discount. It's similar to, as you've seen in mixed use projects, internal capture. So like mixed use projects, you reduce the overall trip generation from that project by 10, 15, 20%, depending on the mix of uses. So like if you have retail on the bottom floor and residential above, and you know that a lot of those residents are going to be going to that retail place, then you can eliminate a certain number of trips associated with that. It's internal capture. Similar to those types of discounts that weren't run through the model afterwards, they were just discounted from the overall, you just lopped it off. That's how it's going to work with this, with VMT. It's very similar. So you don't have to model it again after. You just have to make sure that you have substantial evidence to back up your reductions in VMT based on those mitigation measures that you select.
And is the model being run currently for the monastery against the total allowable number of units estimated for that in the particular zone, which I think was what, over 100, it was 127 or something, Vince, and they're talking about using a much lower number in there?
They're talking about using up to 42 single-family homes, and the capacity there was about 116.
So are we running the model on 116 so that when we show that we're doing 47, that we're
running it on 42?
Yeah, you're 42. So what we are doing, and this is how the model works. So we go into that traffic analysis zone and we see what the underlying land uses are that are existing. And if it was already reflecting that the future would have many more units in the 42, we back those out and then we plug the 42 in, and then you look at the delta. So it just really depends on how it was recorded in the SCAG model. If it was already assumed that that would become single family residential, then yeah, we'll be able to see that comparison. But if it's not, if it's shown as like open space or something else, then it will be compared to nothing. So it'll be 42 houses compared to a baseline of 0.
Be interesting to see, because Tom, you know, the monastery has been talking about developing only the bottom 1/3 of their property. They've been talking about that for a very long time now. They have never really talked about abandoning their entire property for development. They have always intended to keep the retreat center up there and to hold on to the upper 2/3 of that property. Do you recall any differently? It seems that they've always talked about just the bottom 1/3 for development.
Well, it sounds like if I heard Ms. Hayes correctly, it doesn't matter what they talked about publicly, it matters what was in the SCAG model.
Yeah, so I'm wondering about whether they coincide or not. I'm wondering out loud. You're right.
And how do we see the SCAG model? Can we go to
I
SCAG's
can't
website?
even see the SCAG model. It's a monster. It covers 6 counties. It's basically almost all of Southern California except for San Diego County. So it takes about 56 hours if you're lucky for one model run. So it's not something you can just open. I mean, I can open it up. I do have it.
It's based on a baseline that we don't understand. I mean, and the whole thing about the monastery is a perfect example. That if you have a baseline there that's some big thriving institutional use or 116 houses, then a 42 unit project is going to be a big reduction. And if it's based on open space, it's going to be a huge increase.
And it really, I mean, SCAG works pretty closely with all of the cities, and Vincent can probably relay some of this, but every 4 years they update their model. And when they do that update, if cities have adopted a new general plan, or if there's some land use changes that have happened, they take into consideration changes in the assessor parcel information that's available to them. And all of that feeds into this humongous model. So it has not only all your socioeconomic data from the census, but it also has all of the land use information that's provided by the cities. And that's including, like, they manage arena allocations, for example. So they're looking at whenever they update their model, they not only update the existing conditions and try to calibrate it, validate it with what's on the ground today, but then they look at, you know, the horizon year. So this next horizon year, 2040, what does that look like? And what's really interesting is they're moving the model from what's considered a trip-based model to an activity-based model. They're supposed to be releasing it in July, so we're not sure how that's going to look. We're trying to get a copy of it right now, but it'll be really, it's a different way of looking at things, but it's supposed to be easier in a way.
Good luck.
I know.
So did you just indicate to us that all of the planning that we're doing now is going to change in July when they have their new model in 2 months?
I don't think a 6-county model is going to be something anybody is going to be willing to hang their hat on for at least the first 2 years. Kind of like the first model of a new car. Wait for all of the bugs to get out of it before you go using it. So what you're doing is fine. I mean, everybody else in Southern California, all the other counties are doing it the same way. They're using the 2016 RTP data.
That sounds like a yes to me.
It also sounds like we get to work on the bugs.
Yeah, this is what we got. We'll try it out, and when the bugs come out, we'll fix them.
That means that Tom, that means the 2 years when you and I are sharing that it'll be bug fixing time.
They'll hold us accountable for the model in 2 years for what we decide now. That's more likely what will happen. But
I certainly will.
thank you, John. So then, if I heard the timing correctly, Vince, the report's going to come out before our next Planning Commission meeting, which will be before we need to make this recommendation to City Council. Did I hear that timing correctly?
The model will come out next week. You're talking about the recommendation for the VMT or for the recommendation for any proposed project? It sounds like for the VMT. It's going to council on June 9th. Our next planning commission is on June 4th. So we would be able to relay that information to you then.
But based on the timing, you're asking us to recommend this tonight.
That's correct.
Well, you got some silence out of that one.
But we're not going to see any project, you know, for months that even, you know, comes close to needing this kind of review. It's just going to be adopted as city policy.
Is that the extent of what we're putting forth today? Is that we recommend the City Council adopt VMT as opposed to the current way they're doing that?
Yes, and you also have the purview of making changes, for example, to the local serving retail 50,000 square feet would be exempt or less, and you are suggesting that we lower that threshold. That could be included as part of our analysis.
Well, we're not equipped to really be able to study that in any intelligent way, you know, here tonight. Okay, all we could be doing is throwing some dice at the wall about that.
But I mean, I've served on this commission for many, many years, and I can't remember any project that would, you know, trigger this criteria. So I think lowering it is perfectly appropriate.
What?
I think that the model that you looked at with you know, with the corner of Sierra Madre and Baldwin would be the one thing that would trigger. I don't think that there's even any development in Montecito in the industrial area that would trigger. The only other things that would trigger would be the development up on the monastery, and none of those are going to come up to us for, you know, quite a while.
Yeah, the only thing that would have triggered this in the past was the Kensington.
Absolutely.
And, you know, again, on that one, we did a negative declaration. We did a full CEQA, a CEQA review. It wasn't exempt. I think that we're going to find that the pairing of the vehicle miles to sort of roughly gauge to where the categorical exemptions are makes sense to me. And so, you know, I think that makes sense. The 50 seemed out of whack, and it makes sense to lower that down a little bit. But I think we are sort of taking a leap of faith on this, and we're going to have to see how it plays out. But the overall goal of switching to vehicle miles traveled from the congestion, I think, is a good one. But we're gonna find some issues come out of this that we're gonna have to fix. Hopefully, those get discovered in other cities and we can fix it before they come here. But I don't, as you said, I don't think we're going to have a lot of projects that would trip these anyhow, except for the monastery. That's the next one. And when and if, you know, Taylor's Howie site gets redeveloped.
And of course, if, you know, way back in the beginning of this discussion, it was said that we really don't know how long-term the COVID-19 or any other pandemic is going to really be in play, whether the new normal is going to be closer to the old normal, or whether it's going to be radically new. You know, if it turns out to be more radically new, it could have a very, very stifling effect on new building anyway.
Mm-hmm.
There just won't be the same need for new building. We don't know that.
No, we don't. And we're going to have, there's potentially going to be a lot of changes. Whether, you know, however COVID plays out, the post-COVID world is going to be a different one than it is before, but we don't have that data. We've got to take what we have. And according to state law, this has to be adopted by July, right? So
I'm just saying to you, John, that what you just said, I'm in support of that, because I think that COVID may make it much less likely that we will ever have to use it. But that's a gamble too.
I will move that we adopt the resolution with the modification down to 25,000 square feet.
I would second that.
Okay, any other discussion? We have a motion and a second.
Actually, Chair Hutt,
Yes.
we may want to see if we have any public comment. I don't believe we have any information online, but I would like to make that available. And just,
Oh, I didn't realize we could do that. Okay, yeah, let's do that.
well, if we have the call-in number for public comment is 669-900-9128. And the meeting ID is 626-232-0232, with the password being 23224. That information is also on the agenda.
Okay. Could people log in before that?
They could, I have a separate Zoom meeting running, and that's being monitored by IT staff, that they can go in, request that they have public comment. They would call that number, provide the ID number and password, and then they would be able to get live, and then that would be patched into us.
Okay, and nobody's done that yet.
No one is called in for public comment.
Okay, I think if we were going to get that, we would have gotten it already. And if anyone was listening, they're probably asleep. But I think the other part of it is, if we do adopt this tonight, we're just recommending, and if people have real issues, they can bring it to the city council when the city council actually approves these. So I think that we're good to go ahead. Do we have?
And we do have, if we could wait a moment or two to allow people, if they wanted to call in or provide public comment in any way. appears that we don't have any public comments, so if you wanted to proceed, Chair Hutt.
Okay, given that we've got a public hearing on this and we're sort of tough for communications, it probably makes sense to do a poll vote if you want to poll the commissioners. Vincent?
So Chair Hutt,
Yes.
Chair Dennison,
Aye.
Vice Chair Dennison, Commissioners Catalano,
Yes.
Gallus,
Yes.
Desai,
Yes.
Pevsner,
Yes.
and Spears.
Yes.
Okay, great. And motion carries unanimously, and we can move on to our discussion item number 1, which is the state density bonus law update. Do we have a staff presentation?
We have a PowerPoint presentation from our Assistant City Attorney, Alex Garagosian.
All right, let's see if I can share my screen. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
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 All right, perfect. Give me 1 second here. All right, so why are we talking about this now? So Vincent applied for an SB2 grant and was granted it. And so this SB2 grant allows us to do various things that promote affordable housing. We thought this would be probably a good time to update our density bonus ordinance. It's very old. So currently it's located in,
I'm sure.
sorry?
I said I was on the commission when we last adopted it.
Okay, so it was last updated in 2004. There have
Yep.
been 16 amendments since then. I'm currently working on revising it, and it looks totally different. The current law looks totally different than what we have on the books now. The current law is found in Chapter 17.34 of the city's municipal code, if you wanted to look it up. So I think in order to understand why there is this density bonus, we have to kind of understand housing construction costs in the state. So first, according to the Turner Center at UC Berkeley, housing costs in the state can be broken up like so. So we have land costs, obviously, are the cost of land. Hard costs, that's material and labor. And soft costs, that's like your consultants, financing, permitting fees, and basically dealing with the city. So that's only 20 to 30% of your actual costs, but that's what the state has most control over. So that's where we see the most regulation. So within the past 3 years, the state has passed numerous housing bills to try to make housing more affordable in California. It's authorized the creation of housing authorities. So that's the city adopting a housing authority to either subsidize housing or to build its own housing. And then there's obviously public subsidies that the city can provide. But the next 3 are they're not novel, but they've been amended significantly in recent years. The first are regulatory reductions. So allowing for more ministerial approval to get around CEQA, waiving development standards, CEQA reform, making the CEQA process faster, cheaper. There are also regulatory incentives. So a regulatory incentive is like, for example, when you can create a housing district and make every home created in that district exempt from CEQA, for example. Density bonuses are also regulatory incentives. And lastly, we have our regulatory mandates. So that's like an inclusionary housing ordinance, which we don't have in the city. A regional housing needs assessment, all the amendments related to that, and the housing element, obviously. So the history of the density bonus law, just some background. It was enacted in 1979 by Governor Brown in his first term. It was adopted as part of a package, just the density bonus law and affordable housing, related affordable housing statutes. Back then, there was it only did two things. It granted you a density bonus. And just so people know, the people at home are listening, a density is a development standard where we limit the number of units per acre. A density bonus allows you to build more units than normally allowed within that single acre. So the original law just had a density bonus, and there was a companion law that allowed for direct financial contributions toward infrastructure, land, or construction costs. The modern density bonus law has kept a density bonus component, but it's also added concessions and incentives, which I'll talk about, waivers of development standards, which I'll talk about, and reduced parking ratios. So who's eligible for the density bonus? The developer requests, so the developer first has to request it. You don't automatically get it. So a developer requesting a density bonus for a housing development consisting of 5 or more residential units in a mixed use zone or residential zone, who agrees to record a 55-year affordability covenant on the units, to construct a threshold number of affordable senior or qualifying housing, and I'll talk about those thresholds, what they are, or donates land for affordable housing. So here are your minimum thresholds. So you can see if of your entire construction, 5% of your units are for very low income households. And I'll get into what very low and low income household means. Then you qualify for the minimum level of density, for the minimum level of density bonuses. 10% for lower income, 10% for common interest developments, so think condos. If you have a certain number of market rate senior citizen housing, I think it's like 35, you get threshold there, I think is about 35% of the housing. At least 10% of the units are for very low income transitional, foster youth, disabled veterans, or homeless persons. And at least 20% of the units are for lower income student housing, which doesn't really apply to our city. So here are your density bonus thresholds at the different levels. So as you can see, for very low income units, you don't really have to have that many to get a density bonus of, it starts at 20%. And all the density bonuses go up to 35%. One thing to keep in mind, an applicant can't combine different fields. So if you're getting a density bonus for very low income units, you can't also at the same time get a density bonus for low income units or moderately priced income units.
That's under state law.
That's under state law, correct.
If we wanted to locally, could we do that? Because I think I've seen some cities that have that, where you could do some of each, and they have like a translation kind of thing.
Yeah, I've never seen that done where they've combined, but I know that the city can definitely increase or it can lower the thresholds. So if, for example, if the lowest threshold right now is 10% for a 20% bonus, the city can always lower that to be like 8% low income units for a 20% bonus. Similarly, the city can always increase the bonuses too. It can have 10% of the low income units give you a bonus of like 30% if the city wanted, for example. So what are the income limits? So the income limits are published by the state. The average median income in Los Angeles County for this year is $73,100. So here are your income limits. So that's 0 to 30% of $73,100. Is for extremely low income, you have very low income, lower income, and moderate income households. So at moderate income households, you're probably hitting about 90,000. lower income households includes, so this phrase is used a lot for some reason just in the density bonus law, and it includes low income, very low income households and extremely low income households. So sorry, that threshold, it says lower income, it should say low income. And then the term lower income households, it's a separate term of art, and it applies to lower income, very low income, extremely low. So the most recent amendment to the density bonus law was AB 1763. It's pretty dramatic. So first, if you have 100%, so you have your base density units, and then you can get a density bonus on top of your base density. So if 100% of the base density units are affordable, and affordability can mean either, you know, as low as 80% of your units are affordable to lower income households, and a maximum of 20% of your base density units are affordable to moderate income households, but altogether 100% of that is affordable, then you get an 80% density bonus. So before, it was a 35% density bonus was the max. Under the new state law, if you make your entire project affordable, you get an 80% density bonus. And if it's within half a mile of a major transit, and major transit stops defined by state law, I think I have a definition here. Well, I didn't write it down, but it's like a bus stop running every 15 minutes with fixed routes, something like that, and then light rail. Then the city shall not impose any maximum controls on density. So just for example, let's assume we have a 100-unit housing development. If 80 units of that 100-unit housing development are for lower income households, and 20 units are for moderate income households, then you get an 80% density bonus on the 80 units that are for lower income households. You don't get a density bonus for the moderate income households. So that's 64 extra units you get. So you get, for what should have been so normally under the city code, you'd be limited to 100 units. If you get a density bonus under this new state law, you get 164 deed restricted affordable units at that site. And you can get more if you're within half a mile of a major transit stop. So incentives and concessions, these terms are kind of used interchangeably. They're basically three different things. They're either a reduction in site development standards, or a modification code or architectural design requirement that results in identifiable and actual cost reductions, approval of mixed use zoning, or other regulatory incentives or concessions proposed by the local agency or the developer that result in identifiable and actual cost reductions to provide affordable housing costs or rents. When an applicant is allowed to request a certain number of incentives and concessions depending on how many affordable units they're proposing in the project. So as you can see here, you get one incentive or concession when you have a minimum of 5% of your units at very low income, 10% at lower, and 10% at moderate. But under the new state law, you can have up to 4 incentives or concessions if you have 80% at lower income households, restricted at lower income households. So there's also this thing called waivers. Waivers, an applicant doesn't automatically get a waiver. They have to prove, unlike a concession and incentive, an applicant doesn't automatically get a waiver. They have to prove that they need the waiver in order to make the project work. So if compliance with the development standard would physically preclude construction of a housing development, utilizing the density bonus and concessions or incentives, the applicant may submit a proposal for a waiver or reduction of the development standard. There is no maximum limit on the number of waivers an applicant may request. Usually, if the applicant's going to request a waiver, we request some kind of pro forma or something to prove that they actually need this waiver. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to build. So generally, they're only able to waive development standards. These are obviously we talk about density, but these are the different types of development standards that they may be able to waive under the density bonus law. And you can always deny an incentive, concession, or waiver, but you have to make the following findings. So first, this is an or, so it can be any of these. Does not result in identifiable and actual cost reductions. Would have a specific adverse impact on public health or safety, or on any property listed in the California Register of Historical Resources, and there is no feasible method to satisfactorily mitigate or avoid the impact without rendering the development unaffordable to low and moderate income households. And lastly, it'd be contrary to state or federal law. So these are the reasons to deny an incentive, concession, or waiver. And remember, incentives and concessions, they get that, the applicant gets that if they get a density bonus. It's a package. But the waiver, they have to prove up. So if an applicant gets a density bonus and they get their concession and they get their incentive and they get their waiver, they can still also get this parking ratio reduction. And as you can see, it's broken down. It's actually pretty, this has been amended quite a bit recently. So this is all pretty much new. And the writing in red at the bottom, that's the newest edition under the state law that was passed this year. So if 100% of your units are lower income and they're either supportive housing or special needs housing with paratransit or access to fixed bus routes, we actually can't require any parking for that structure, for that project.
Well, how's a disabled person supposed to get it to and from their home if there's no parking?
Yeah, well, we can't require it is the issue, I guess.
Yes, but if we found out that it was otherwise, looking at the particular development, that it was otherwise going to be required under Title 24 or under ADA, then that would override this, I believe.
Yeah, well,
think?
yeah, this wouldn't prevent other state laws from requiring it. And I suppose they probably would if it's going to be a special needs housing. I imagine that, I'm not sure, but I imagine under state law, there is some kind of requirement that for special needs housing, you'd have to have a certain number. I mean, for structures, for projects in general, there's a certain number of handicap parking spaces that are required. So I imagine for special needs housing, there might be more.
Yeah, that's what I would assume.
Yeah, there would be a real discrimination issue, a real civil rights issue if you were to just follow this and say no parking.
Yeah. So this was just intended as a general overview, and I can take your questions at the next meeting. We'll be going over the specific amendments that we're proposing for the density bonus law, and just so you know, the density bonus law, whether we adopt it or not, applies. It's state law. It's like the ADU law. It's background law. It's going to apply whether we update our ordinance or we don't update ordinance. But if we update our ordinance, we have more flexibility in what we decide we want to favor in the city. So if we want, for example, senior citizen housing, we can provide greater density bonuses and make senior citizen housing more attractive for developers, for example. So at this point, I can take any questions if you have it.
So what are we supposed to do with this tonight?
Nothing tonight. This was just this was just an overview. If you had questions, I can answer. But then we're going to get into discussion when you are presented with the amendments at the next meeting.
Alex, I have a question. What happens in the case, you outlined a case where if you had 100% affordable units and you got the 80% density. And there was also a scenario where you could have unlimited density bonus, basically. What stops that? What limits that? Like, because
Height.
you can also apply for a height variance too, right? You can a waiver for that, right? So is it conceivable that on a decent sized property you could almost build unlimited?
Well, there are you have your other development standards, right? So there's square footage, there's height. You can request, you probably wouldn't get the waiver, right? Because you can probably make that project, you'd have to prove that that project couldn't work, but you can get a concession or an incentive to get a couple more floors, but the concession or the incentive wouldn't waive the height requirement.
Got it. Okay. So there is
I'm
some
going-
checks and balances there of some sort to limit that. I mean, it would be an extraordinary project, but it's possible. Like, I assume it's conceivable you could almost double the density or triple the density on a property if you did the math right.
Yeah, you could probably double it. And just to note, I didn't mention this earlier. When you get a density bonus, the density bonus units generally can be market rate. But if you're going for that 100% affordable, where you get the 80% density bonus, not only are all the units in the not only are all the base density units deed restricted, but so are the density bonus units. Those also are deed restricted. So you're right. That's a special project. I feel like that's going to be more like a nonprofit trying to build affordable housing for people, as opposed to a developer coming in and trying to build that.
Question for you on the incentives and waivers. Can those be used to do away with the city's impact fees?
Yeah, they can. You can request it. I don't know if it gets rid of the entire impact fee. I think because they just have to show that the project is still feasible. So I don't know that you can get rid of the entire impact fee. Maybe Vincent would know better, but yes, it can apply to impact fees. I know that.
I believe
And
you can apply the impact fee, but I'm not sure if that would be part of a waiver.
It wouldn't be part of the waiver, but I think you can use it for your incentives or your concessions.
And all of the things you presented to us tonight are the things that are in state law. And so if we wanted to do more, we could.
Yes, and I'm going to present more options when we go through the amendment. I'll highlight sections where there's flexibility for us to amend.
But if we want to do less, we can't. That's sort of the bar. The state
Right.
law is the bar.
Yeah,
okay.
everything I presented today is like the baseline.
Well, because one of the issues also is the definition of project that you could apply this to is 5 or more.
Uh-huh.
And all of the examples that you see generally are for these bigger projects that we just won't have in town. And so one of the questions is whether we want to try to apply this to smaller things where there's like 4plexes or something, or a 3plex, that normally you wouldn't do this, but we have a lot of smaller sites in town. And, I think we're not going to have a whole bunch of sites that we're going to even be able to, however we structure this, that it could be applicable unless we decide to lower that 5 or more number.
I don't think we can lower the 5 or more number. That's not in our control because that's like the definition of a housing development under the density bonus law. We can play with, so it'd have to be more than 5. It's not one of the things we can amend, unfortunately.
In other words, a developer is going to have to be going for a baseline of more of a certain minimum number of units before any of the math kicks in, any of this can come into play.
Right.
You couldn't have 5% on a 3-unit project, for instance, right?
You couldn't have, I mean, we could set it at 3% if we wanted to, but under state law, no.
No, I mean, it would be a silly fraction of a unit, so it would be a minimum of one for anything like that, and that would so I think that's going to right there create a floor for.
Yeah.
Yeah, but one of the things about the way the code works, Joe, is that for affordable units, it's always rounded up. So if you do the math and you get 1.2 bonus units, that's 2 bonus units.
Right.
So you don't use normal math when you're doing affordable housing. Just
No,
keep
that's
that in
what
mind.
I was suggesting, so that to make anything really work under this, it's probably going to be a fairly big project for Sierra Madre, as you were suggesting.
Right.
Beside the Kensington, Vincent, is there any other building in Sierra Madre that's, 10 plus units?
Not really, besides a senior housing project.
Yeah, the senior housing project.
The senior housing project in Esperanza.
So you only have
And
2
also,
projects.
yes, there's another one, and that is the Irving Gill apartments and the later additions up at Alegria and Mountain Trail. There's definitely an excess of 10, 11 in there. I don't know.
Right. There's a lot of projects in town that have more than 10 units, but there haven't been recently. It's just been those 2, the Kensington and the senior housing.
Mhm.
All the other stuff was sort of
Way old.
way old. Yeah, that's the right term.
Alex, can I ask a question on density going along that line?
Oh, sure. Who is this? I can't see.
It's Bill Pesner. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
My number, but I'm on another screen. Sorry. That half mile, the density bonus, the half mile from any major transit. Did I understand you correctly? It says there's no maximum control on density. And if so, does that mean that that bus line that goes up Sierra Madre Boulevard, that if you're within a half mile and there's a piece of property that they want to build, who knows? I mean, 3 stories in one, and then they want a height exemption, they could conceivably build a 4-story, low-income, level housing development? Or am I understanding that density, there's no maximum control on density within a half mile of the major transit?
Yeah.
Correct.
No, I think that's correct for the most part. So there are a couple of questions we need to figure out ahead of time. So the first question is, does that bus line come every 15 minutes? Because if it doesn't, then it's not the type of transit stop that's contemplated by the density bonus law. So that provision wouldn't apply.
And the city of Sierra Madre is also just a bit further than a half mile from a transit station. And Metro is also considering eliminating our bus line through town because of low ridership.
Yeah,
Well,
so that probably won't apply to Sierra Madre.
Okay, I'm just, wondering how, if something changed and it's going the other direction, but if it didn't, I can just see Taylor's turning into a 4-level, low-income housing. Similar to what they're doing around the transit lines, where they're building all these condo units that are crammed around them so people could walk to work, which sort of makes sense, but I'm not sure it makes sense for our town.
Right, and that's what this law is. This law is geared for, Los Angeles and San Francisco. But it applies to the state.
But we don't have any of those transit stops in town, so we're just going to be, adding a unit or 2 to a small project is how it would play out here.
Okay, I'm just playing the devil's advocate. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Vincent, back to you.
So at this time, we would take public comment. So I'm just going to go ahead and repeat what I said earlier. This is the time to take public comment. And individuals can call in at 669-900-9128. The meeting ID is 626-232-0232. And the password is 232242. We can pause for a moment. We don't have anybody online requesting public comment at this point.
Well, I'd like to take a minute to thank Alex for the presentation. That was informative.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Yeah, happy to do it.
I thought that was very helpful, and I'm sure we're going to get even more of it at the next meeting.
So we'll take one moment to see if anybody does call in. Right now, we have no callers. So why don't we go ahead and wrap up our discussion? And any further questions from the commissioners?
I have none.
No.
Okay, then let's move to our second discussion, which is structures located in the public right-of-way or front yard setback. Do we have a staff report on this?
We have, I just wanted to open it up. I did provide a very brief staff report with a background regarding walls and fences and other structures such as arbors, which has come to the attention of staff lately. And essentially, the code does regulates structures in the front yard setback to not exceed 25 or 42 inches in height. There is a provision, however, if you wanted to have a structure up to 10 feet, such as an arbor structure at the front property line, it would require a minor conditional use permit. It would also have to be located outside of the public right-of-way, so it would have to be definitely on private property. And because many of our residential neighborhoods are void of sidewalks, that always comes into contention exactly where that property line is, but we can certainly define that. So we do have a mechanism in place for those who do want to install a structure in their front yard setback, and that is the minor conditional use permit. And if you have any other questions specific to that, I'd be happy to answer them.
Well, so what was the reason that this was brought before us for
This
discussion?
was asked at the last meeting to be put on the agenda as a discussion item by Commissioner Pevsner.
For what reason?
To
Oh,
discuss.
I'll tell you, Joe. Sorry. Yeah, that was brought up by me because I have 3 neighbors that have brought it up to me and had considerable consternation trying to either get it done or just gave up on the whole idea of having an arbor. It was specific to the arbor, not the fencing. And so when they went to put up what they thought was a simple, wooden arbor structure, they got either red tagged or something. And some of them had to pay penalties and fees, and they were pretty upset. And I wanted to just see if there was some way, if that particular structure could somehow be separated from the other, I guess what he was talking about, the minor use permits for fences and walls and things like that, because somebody does it as a decorative, almost a mobile type item, and then next thing you know, they have pictures and notices from the city or neighbors taking picture of it, and they feel like public enemy #1 for trying to beautify their front walkway. And that was my main issue for bringing it up, to see where it fell in the code, and if there's any way to maybe separate that out and ask the city council to consider a specific ordinance just for arbors separate from walls and fences.
Yeah, if you look around, it seems that there are a lot of homeowners and a lot of small contractors who have no idea that any of this is regulated at all. You know, a handful of years ago, somebody new in town across the street from me went and put up. Well, he had a small contractor put up all of this metal fencing, and then of course a city staffer came by, saw it. They wound up having to cut it all down. Apparently, this contractor had no idea, or just thought he was free to do it, or he'd get away with it, or whatever. So I mean, we have, yeah, you know. So it's a matter of excessive difficulty for the people who do know and do want to comply versus the issues of people who are out to lunch about the whole thing.
Well, but it's a different issue than a fence. I mean, one of the two issues was these were all put up by the homeowners themselves. Well, one was not. One was put about, a guy inherited it. He bought a house where the arbor was put up as an attractive feature to sell the house. And then he bought it, and as soon as he bought it, he got a notice from the city that said your arbor's not legal. So he, took it down, and because he didn't want to go through the process of noticing and paying. It ended up being, for them, a simple arbor could be as much as $2,500. The other person had put it up themselves and then got noticed and penalized by the high. And I think when he went in to inquire to try and get a permit for it, he got double penalized of some sort, and between the noticing and everything else, and the excessive penalties the fee then was doubled somehow, and then it ended up being over $3,000 for a simple wooden thing that he put up with some blocks, and it wasn't. I don't even think it was even that permanent of a structure, but because it stuck up with an archway and had some plants that were going to be attached to it, it somehow triggered this, and so they were upset. And to me, it seemed like a separate entity than a fence. So I don't know if there's any way to get the city council to consider it as a separate structure with separate definitions, and maybe with separate fee structures, just because it seems like, you could spend a couple $100 on an arbor that you'd have to get $2,000 in permits for. That's the kind of explanation I got from these people, and the frustration, especially when, they had no idea, but they didn't really inquire. But it seemed like it didn't seem like they were putting up a fence or any kind of obstructive construction in their front yard, especially when it was just hovering over the walkway that was already there.
There's so much relief for, there's so much relief for, like if you're doing a shed on your property that's under 120 square feet, I think it is, that you have to fly it by planning, but there's nothing, there's no building department, anything like that. We have all kinds of relief for something as simple as a backyard shed. It's, as long as you're in compliance with zoning here, what's the big deal? Do we even have to charge a fee?
It does seem a little bit out of whack that you can plant a hedge or a big tree, but if you had an arbor that rose vine trellis stuff on, then all of a sudden you've got to have all this regulation, which is going to look very much the same to the neighbors. And so I think maybe there's something we could do on with regard to the sort of the temporariness or the permanentness of the that could be a distinction, because these are kind of things that do seem problematic and sort of overly regulated. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, and Joe knows this because he helped me with it, I have walls along my driveway, and at the end there's lights, and the walls are underneath, so they didn't require this, but the lights go above 42 inches, so I had to get a minor conditional use permit just to put 2 lights on the end of the walls. So it seemed sort of ridiculous at the time,
That's pretty silly.
but the lights are pretty, so I'm
What did those 2 lights really cost you?
Well, the minor conditional use permit was $700 and something. So
Yeah.
The
It's
lights
pretty-
were $100 a piece.
It's
So
pretty
they
funny.
ended up on average being $1,000 for those 2 lights.
You know, it's pretty funny that we have height restrictions on buildings, but if you wanted but you can get relief from that for say a spire or some other kind of architectural feature that that goes above. But here, because the lights stood up above the wall, he had all this trouble with it. That's really like ridiculous.
Well, I think one of the issues is we really don't have, for something this minor, we don't have a tool that you can review and approve that doesn't cost, a fair amount of money as a percentage of the thing you're considering. And I don't know if there's really an answer to it other than to sort of maybe build a list of exemptions for like temporary structures or wood structures that can easily be removed or something like that, so that staff could just review and approve them with a building permit instead of going through the whole process. And for me, it was $700 something, and I think the fee is a little more now. But I knew about the rule being on the planning commission, so I complied. But if I hadn't, then, like as you said, it would have been the double fee for not complying, and that also seems somewhat onerous because that's not an obvious thing. It's not like somebody who built a 2-story structure without getting any permits, which you should have known better. It's the kind of thing that people could think there is no regulation and easily could go do. So I think that's maybe a little bit punitive as well.
You may not even really need a much of an ordinance for this at all. I'm wondering how much of the situation can be covered with a simple compliance handout sheet that would be obtainable at City Hall. The building department has plenty of handout sheets for other things. I think that if there's going to be an issue, it may just be in the realm of contractor and homeowner education. But the compliance, physically, the compliance, I would think would be something simple enough that it could be on 2 sides or maybe just even one side of a single 8.5 by 11 printed sheet. It shouldn't cost $3,000 to have to review.
The fee is not because of the review, it's because of the noticing. It's because you send all your neighbors within, 300 or 200 feet. You have to send postcards to all. So that's
sure.
where the cost.
Maybe,
Yeah,
maybe for the smaller things like arbors, we can just do an over-the-counter sort of review without noticing. And also not do a punitive fee, because it seems like an innocent mistake to just pay the fee.
It would be very interesting to hear from the public about whether the public, if we could get enough of a sampling, even thinks that noticing is necessary. Where just do people care that much about it?
Right. I mean, the other thing we could do is just have the noticing being a sign on the property as opposed to those little yellow cards, because those are really pretty costly to send those to people within a 300-foot radius. And I think most people just sort of put them in with their junk mail, and they don't often. I know for my 2 lights, nobody even responded. They didn't even call and ask. So they didn't know that I was building something giant and ugly or just 2 lights. So I think, maybe just a sign is plenty of notice, because then the neighbors who could be impacted will see the sign and decide if there's an issue or not.
I don't know, there's a discussion on the internet right now about our action on Santa Anita, and the complaint was lack of noticing, that they somehow, the new structure was snuck in the dead of night, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not quite sure that we want to give,
Which house is
The one that we had a sign in front of.
the one that had the sign in front of them, the one we had 2 meetings about, the one that went, but right now, apparently there's some people running around rather upset because somehow their right to a view was, compromised. And one of the complaints is that no one ever told them. So I think our
Well, if we had a public hearing, they got those notices in the mail.
Commission,
I-
I'd request we don't talk about this one because there's been a litigation threat, so.
I rest my case.
Okay, so, yeah, let's not talk about that. But it still goes. I don't want to talk about that one in particular. But I think that the noticing by those cards is pretty worthless. So I recognize that that's what's required in law. But it would be nice if we had some other form of notice that was more useful and more cost effective. And I'll leave it to some genius to figure out how to do that. But
Okay.
Yeah, those are good suggestions. I think the noticing was one fee. I have to say it. I think the fines and the increased fees itself were what were prohibitive. A couple of them were just like, when it got to be, well, you're going to have to pay double the fee now because you already put it up, so that's your punishment. And then the noticing was only about, I think only about $500. But so the one guy who did it himself got disgusted and just said, forget it, I'm tearing it down, I'm not, just don't do anything. And then that was the end of it, and he walked out. So I mean, if we don't want to encourage trellises or arbors like that, I guess we can say, okay, tough, just leave the regulation. I just thought it could be carved out and not have to require, all this noticing as if you're putting up a fence and all that other kind of stuff. Just like if you're repairing your side yard fence and you weren't going to go above the height level, but your neighbor complained because you changed from wood to block or something like that. And you got a permit, but you wouldn't have to do any noticing that I know of, as long as you're just replacing existing. This seems to fall into that category. I just wanted to try and get rid of some of the punitive stuff and just the cost in general, just because it's such a minor structure, a minor thing. It's not the same, not a barrier to the property. It shouldn't be an obstruction if it's not in the public right of way. And, it's, like I said, a decorative item. And since I had several people, sort of getting tweaked about it, it brings up all these issues like what Bob alluded to, but not so much that they didn't get noticed, but it just seems like I'm putting up this little wooden structure and all of a sudden I'm getting, jumped on by government, and they don't realize it. And
many times these structures are located in the public right of way, not even on private property. And if it is located in the public right of way, you still can maintain a structure with an encroachment permit, but you would have to acknowledge that if there was any work done in that right of way, that structure would have to be removed.
Well, yeah, but these were set back. I'm just saying if they're on private property and within the whatever, it just seems like I think the reason people never checked was they think about fences and other things, and they think if this is more of a decorative garden item, like John said about like putting in a tree, and something, especially if you're going to put some plants on it that's going to grow, it's more like an appendage of the greenery than it is a hard structure. So I don't know. I was just trying to bring it out from wherever it was buried in the code as a separate item, so people stop feeling like they're penalized from the city.
How often have we had a problem with somebody not knowing where the property line is and building something like this within the public right of way? I don't know that everybody really understands where the front property line is relative to the street curb.
It doesn't come up too frequently. And also regarding code enforcement, we only respond to complaints from other neighbors.
He made it sound like the city came by and took pictures and.
We did, but we would. It was initiated by a neighbor.
Okay, but who had the before pictures? Them, the neighbor?
It could be. They could submit photographs. We can look on Google Earth and other street views from Google Earth to determine if the structure was there prior or before, once we open up an investigation. But our code enforcement is not, is basically just responding to other complaints from residents.
Well, I don't think he knew that. Well, either way, and who knows? Because the house that was bought and with the trellis put in for decoration, I suppose it had to have come up from a neighbor because he got notice from the city, and he goes, you know, his attitude is, I bought this house and this was already here. What the heck, you know? And so I don't know. It's sad that you know, if that would happen to somebody who's a new neighbor and all of a sudden he's being sort of put upon by his neighbors and he doesn't even know how to respond. He doesn't even know where it's coming from. But since he just bought the house, it's just.
Well, if it
All
was,
right, well,
if it was something that was recommended by the real estate agent as a sales feature, then it's quite possible that by the time the whole thing came around, the poor people had already bought the house and moved in.
Yeah.
When they first got noticed by the city on it, right? And the real estate agent should know better anyway.
Or it could have been, I don't know who it, I think the previous owner did it, but regardless, I mean, whoever's listing the property, who knows?
Yeah.
My recollection of realtors is they try and stay out of those kind of things. They don't even question the owner. If the owner put it up, it's sort of the way it is. And if you don't ask, they're not going to tell you. Well, if it can't be carved out of the regulations to recommend to city council, I don't know what else can do. I just like to try and reduce some of the punitive fees. It seems like, I mean, you can go to get something you could put in a planter box and probably cost you $100, and then you're going to have to pay $2,000 for it if you want to keep it there.
Must be a pretty ugly planter box if your neighbors are going to go complain to the city about it.
That's a whole another psychological bag of worms, Joe. I mean, sometimes people, you wonder why they didn't say it when the guy put it up before the guy bought the house. They waited till somebody else bought the house and then they made it his problem. Who knows? That's a psychology that I can't analyze. I'm just trying to save people who get caught up in it from being in a dilemma of having to put thousands of dollars into something that just seems like a decorative garden item.
I would agree that we could make that we could make it much more fair than what you're describing right now. It's a matter of what do you want to do with it. I think it's quite possible.
Isn't it a matter for the city council? I mean, I was hoping to get a consensus on some recommendations and maybe have them then try and either put it as a subcode wherever it exists, the letter C, B, D, or E, with some specifics that give it different parameters from where it's been lodged right now.
Well, I think wouldn't it be a matter if we decide that we want to have a subcommittee to draft a recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, if we think it makes sense to amend the code, we could either do that, and I got some helpers here if you noticed.
Yeah.
We could either have a public hearing to do that directly if it's not so complicated, or we could have a subcommittee to take a look at it and then come back. I think it probably is, because this is an interaction both with the noticing issues and the thresholds for a minor use permit. It might make sense to have a subcommittee that could take a look at it and then come back later on with a recommendation to the full committee. And then the commission could recommend it on to city council.
And we would actually have to get direction from city council.
For what?
Before forming a subcommittee on this matter.
We would.
It's okay. That's all I was asking for.
Well, why don't we do this? I mean, we've got some other code amendments on our plate. We've got to get back to the commercial code and get that processed. So why don't we just ask staff to go check with the council and the city manager and see where this falls, and if we can, after we get some of those other things done, if we can pursue this. I think it's something that it's probably not a huge priority, but it's something that also shouldn't be that difficult to deal with. And if we had a subcommittee, you know, the subcommittee could come back to us with some recommendations.
This is John Capote. If I could just comment for a second, I would support something like that. I do think that's a little outrageous to be, you know, fining or even getting a permit and going through the cost for something as simple as that. So that's my personal opinion on it, but I just tell you, I would support that.
Okay, I think that, thanks,
you.
John, that's helpful. So I think the other thing is this is just a discussion item, so we obviously can't take any action tonight. But we can request staff to inquire if we can move forward on this, and if so, to put it on a future agenda, and we can form a subcommittee then.
Yeah, we'll certainly.
Okay, do we have any other questions on that? We've got staff, do you feel like you have enough direction on that from us?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, seeing no other discussion on that, we will move on to Planning Commission reports. Do any commissioners have reports?
I have nothing.
Okay, great. Then we will go on to Planning and Community Preservation staff reports.
Just to alert you, for our next project, we do have a design review permit scheduled for our June 4th hearing. We also have the density bonus law amendments. We'll look at the detail of the proposed ordinance amendments for that. And it looks like currently those are the only two items. Possibly we will also have another discussion item regarding the commercial code and how we're proceeding, moving that project forward. That concludes my comments.
Okay, and that's June 4th, right?
That's June 4th.
And then the council is going to consider the vehicle miles traveled issue on June, their
9th.
next meeting after that?
Yes, June 9th.
June 9th. So if we do want to, if we think of anything else or any other ideas, commissioners can keep in mind that the council is going to consider that on the 9th, and you can contact council or go to that meeting or Zoom that meeting, I guess. And is there a way we can get a look at the test calculation that we talked about?
Yes,
for
I
the
can
monastery?
include that on the agenda, and we can have a, hopefully, whatever the format might be, we can provide that to the Planning Commission.
Okay, that would be great, because I think that would be helpful to understand how the process works, because the one we had tonight was, although it was interesting, it was sort of nebulous in the abstract, and so seeing how it applies on a particular project, I think would be useful.
We'll do that.
Okay. Anything else?
That concludes my
Okay.
comment.
I did
Right.
actually, sorry, I did have a
Yeah.
question. I know that eventually here, we're going to get closer back to normal. Are there any plans on when we will start meeting back in council chambers at safe distances?
I think this will be a phased approach. We still have not fully opened up City Hall at this point, so I would imagine that would be the next step before we hold meetings of 10 individuals or more in one room. So we're gonna have to wait and see what the state order allows for larger venues.
Right, and to clarify, the LA County order and the state order still prevent gatherings of 2 people or more. So we cannot, we currently can't meet.
And how long, when does the county ordinance run till?
The county the county public health officer's order, I'm not sure when it expires, but I know they're going to extend it. They're talking about extending it through July. So
Through the end of July?
no, not through the end of July. I heard talk about extending it through the beginning of July.
Okay. So basically we're in a phase of, we're in this until we hear otherwise. It's about as much planning as we have, right?
Right.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, great. We will adjourn until our next meeting, which is June 4th.
Great,
Night.
thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.